Hey everybody, and welcome back to Techstrong Unplugged. I'm your host, Tan Solomon, and this is episode 32 of our series. In this episode, we're taking you to AI Dev Summit 2024. There, our co-host Cassandra Chin met up with Jake Reichert, and they discussed AI, iteration, and timing the tech market. Jake is a seasoned software developer and engineering leader with more than 20 years of experience. In this episode, he'll discuss the strategic decisions that drive innovation at major tech companies, as well as the intricacies of launching new products. Without further ado, let's head over to AI Dev Summit 2024.
Welcome back to Techstrong Unplugged. My name is Cassandra Chin, and today we're here with Jake. Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Jake Reichert, and I am a software developer and engineering leader. And I've been a developer and manager for 20 plus years at this point, in anywhere from getting startups off the ground from a handful of people up to managing teams at Amazon.
Do you want to talk about maybe how you got started into technology?
Yeah, so my background originally was in math and physics, and at the time that I was in school, there was still a lot of the internet that was being figured out and built, and I realized pretty quickly that was what I wanted to be working on. I wanted to be a part of figuring out how to solve some of those problems, and just kind of blazing this trail in an area nobody really knew. It was not that dissimilar from the landscape now with AI, with that same kind of level of excitement and passion around it that people had. So I went to school in San Francisco, and that was clearly a place where there's a lot of energy around that. So just being around it all the time, I was very interested to be a part of it.
And along your journey, have you been to startups and lots of different companies?
Yeah, so I've worked at, I would say predominantly I've worked at startups that are anywhere from 30 up to 200 people. But I've also worked at places that are larger and smaller. At the largest end, I worked at Amazon. I was part of Amazon Music. I was managing a lot of the teams doing front end development for pretty much everything that was not voice. So web browsers, phones, TV sets, you name it. And at the other end of it, I've been involved with companies where I was one of the co-founders, and starting from that level and building up from there.
It's a lot of interesting things you've done.
Yeah, I would say, there's one of the things that's interesting to me is, I've been predominantly in the startup world. I went to Amazon mostly because I wanted to learn things that I felt like maybe I couldn't learn those at a small organization, but I wanted to take those lessons and apply them, elsewhere. But for me, there's always kind of been this real excitement to working in the startup environment because, there is, of course, a high risk of failure, but there's also just this level of excitement that it's hard to find in some other positions. You're usually not working at a startup because you're not excited about it. Everybody there is usually 100% behind whatever the company's mission is and really trying to make that thing a reality. And sometimes you succeed, sometimes you fail, but the journey in it, I think, is probably more important than kind of the end result.
It's a really different environment when everyone's really passionate for what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, for sure. And also where people might have, particular expertise in particular areas that they're really looking to apply. Early on, I remember one of the places that I worked at was a startup that it never made it. You never would have heard of it, but it was building the first chat software, like voice chat software over the internet. And this is when still everybody was on dial-up modems. And there was a guy in France who was our CTO, who basically his background was in signal processing and data compression, which was pretty much what you're doing with speech recognition. So he had come up with this idea for how to build this, and even though most people at the time felt like, well, there's not enough bandwidth when you go outside of a local network, over the wider internet to make that work, he felt like, no, I feel like I have a plan to make that work. I was a junior developer at that point, so I came in, basically took a lot of direction from him. I learned a lot in the process, but seeing that actually work, I still remember the day when we started having our meetings over the internet and being able to talk through it. And, it's compared to today, it was scratchy. There's a lot of, it breaking up, but it was just like that factor of like, I can't believe this actually works. It is that same feeling that you have when you're like talking to, Chat GPT, and it's like, how does it do this? It was that same level of kind of like feeling like magic.
This is not entirely polished, but it's really new and it feels magical.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the things that I think is true at any startup is you can't really be a perfectionist, right? You have to be willing to build something, put it out there, figure out what people like about it, really take that feedback into consideration, and then quickly do something with it, right? Which basically means you're not trying to build a finished product right out the gate, because it might not be the right one. Like, you have to actually put something out there and just like, that's enough for your customers to be able to say, is this good enough? Is it not good enough? My current company that I'm a co-founder at, Sagean AI, we're building real-time conversational avatars. And we've gone through probably, 7 iterations in the last 9 months of kind of what the core of the product looked like. Who was the audience? Was it more like large businesses? Was it consumer end users? And a lot of that was just seeing the usage patterns when we put it out there. Like, what are people using it for? I'll give one example is that, we'd come out with it originally thinking this is going to be really interesting to retailers as like a virtual customer assistant agent. And we have gotten interested in that, but the place we've gotten a surprising amount of interest is from consumer end users who are paying to use it as a conversational partner for learning English, which is not something we ever designed it for. Or even, we had our list of 20 things that we thought, oh, here are all the things that people might use this for. That wasn't anywhere on that list. Like, we're as surprised as anybody else. But instead of just saying, that's curious, and ignoring it, we basically said, oh, okay, well, if that's what people are actually willing to pay for, like, let's do more of that. Like, let's find out what is it that those people are interested in. That could be just like sending out a survey to them and saying, like, what do you think of this and this? What are the top 5 features you'd like to see in this? And then using that to shape the next kind of iteration of development. And on the flip side, you have to be willing to throw out what you think are like your best ideas if people don't actually care about them, right? You can work on these things all day long that you think are like the coolest CS or product feature kind of ever, but if nobody's actually interested in using that, from the perspective of building a business, it's not really worth putting a lot of time into.
That's really difficult. You have to reprioritize your ideas and really listen to user feedback.
You do, and it's I think a lot of people, their first instinct is to reject that feedback. Even people who are kind of seasoned professionals, if somebody gives you negative feedback about your product, it's very easy to get defensive about that. And I think it takes a while to get used to the idea of like, well, they're not putting you down. It's not about you personally. They're not saying that like you're somebody who comes up with bad ideas. They're just saying like, this isn't useful for me the way that it is. Now you do have to weigh that off against, you can't like jump on one piece of feedback from one person and say like, oh, well, we never thought of that, and then change your whole strategy, right? But if you start to see that pattern, I don't necessarily mean from like, tens of thousands of users. We usually are able to make pretty good decisions based on feedback from like, a dozen, 2 dozen users. You can see enough commonality in there. It's like, it's probably not strictly speaking statistically significant, but it's enough that it's like, it's probably right. You're directionally probably right if you're like 5 of those people said this and that feels right, so let's kind of do things in that direction. And then there's other things that you have to listen to and say, yeah, thanks for your feedback. It's not the direction we're going in with this. It's either, just like not our expertise, not the company we're trying to build, maybe somebody else will, or just like we're not excited about going in that direction.
Before you talked about the use case for language, like is that company still like going that direction now?
No, that company was it was interesting, and I think we're going to see a lot of this in the AI landscape as well. It's kind of a victim of timing. The infrastructure just wasn't there, or maybe the need wasn't quite there at the time that we were building it. We thought it was pretty great, and we found a few companies who thought it was pretty great as well. But at the end of the day, there wasn't a compelling use case for it of people saying, well, why do I need to talk to people over the internet? Now today it's kind of obvious what some of those things might be, but at the time it was, I think that we were spending a lot of our time in customer meetings trying to convince people why they would need something like this. And in my experience, it's much easier to sell things into customers when it's like you're solving an existing need than trying to create a need and then telling people they should like be interested in that, And that's not impossible. I mean, that's essentially what Facebook did, right? It's like, it's not like everybody in the world was on a social network. They were looking for, the next best social network when Facebook came out. They basically created this platform, and people then like saw this thing that they wanted that they'd never been on before. Same thing with, just as simple as like early broadband providers, right? Like, why do I need this, pay all this money for a faster internet connection? Like, I can check my email just fine, right? But like, that is one approach to it. But for consumer products, I think it is typically easier to get people interested in something that like where there's like, here's a need and we're going to fill it. So that one, that was an example of where a few years later, Skype took off. Of course, they had video in it as well, and the bandwidth was there to support that, which we didn't have available to us at the time. An example I think of a lot is I had a friend who worked at a company they had this idea of building a portal where you could, upload video of like, your friends and family or just like short movies that you made yourself and like then like have it so that anybody in the world could like go and watch them. And, sounds a lot like YouTube, but it was like 2 years before YouTube and they didn't make it because same thing, like the broadband adoption wasn't there. And so the process of actually watching the videos was just like too slow. And so had it been 2 years later, probably would have been a great idea. But sometimes there's an element of timing that goes into it as well that you just, you have to take your best shot. You can't really factor that in, there's no timing the market there. You just have to do it and see if it's people are going to use it then or not.
Yeah, that's very tricky when we're talking about timings.
Right.
And I always hear the phrase, like, don't time the market in stocks.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit like that, right? You do have to be thoughtful about what's possible with the technology that's out there, So like as an example, at Sagen, one of the things that we struggled with early on was the responsiveness. You would say something to these 3D avatars, and it would be this pause started out fairly long, like 10 to 12 seconds. It was down to 4 seconds, but even at 4 seconds, it felt like a little bit long. And we got some sort of expert advice from people, in the AI space working on these topics in particular. And they did some research that, based on, what we see out there, we don't think this is possible. We looked at it and said, well, we don't agree. We think it is. And we were able to figure out, not using any tricks related to making the response from the LLM faster, which is kind of what they were looking at, but looking at making all the stuff around it faster, So we did all kinds of things like introduced message-based architecture. So, you could ask questions, have the responses come back kind of asynchronously. If the response is going to be 5 sentences, have your text-to-speech renderer, process all 5 sentences at once and then send them back. It gave the illusion, and then we would sequence them back in the right order when it would speak it back. That would then give the impression to the end user that it was faster than it was. Or one thing we did, which was kind of the audio equivalent of, when you see spinners or like a waiting button when you press a button to like submit a credit card number or something like that, which was you would ask a question and then we'd have the stock phrase that would say like, that's an interesting question, or let me think about that. And we'd throw those in every once in a while if the wait was starting to feel too long. And then that gave the illusion that there was less of a wait than there actually was. So that we're trying to use as much as we can to our advantage of what's out there today. But a lot of that was us really thinking about what do we think is possible with the given state of technology. But then there's certain other things that we've said, there X, Y, and Z could be cool things we could do, but not now, because we actually don't think the technology is there to do that today, even if we really push the envelope. It's just there's too many other problems that need to get solved first that we ourselves don't know how to solve. And so those are things we're not going to make a gamble on those ones for right now.
That definitely makes sense. There's a lot of strategy involved when handling startups and what to invest technologies.
Yeah, I mean, you're as opposed to a large company, you're always going to be struggling for resources, both human resources and financial resources. And so you really have to prioritize what's the most important. And that can be harder than you think. It's not an obvious thing, especially as the priorities keep changing depending on the feedback that you're getting. And a lot of it is just sort of going with your gut instinct, or your experience, what you've seen work in the past, what you haven't. But yeah, you can't, there's not going to be enough time to work on everything that you think is interesting. So you really do need to get really, really good at both prioritizing, like what order you're going to work on, and also, and this is a hard one for a lot of people, is failing fast, right? You know, if you work on something and you think it's awesome, but you put it out there and people hate it, don't double down on a bad mistake, right? Like, you don't want to say like, well, okay, but if we only did these 5 things, then maybe people really like it. And then you spend the time to do those 5 things, and people still don't like it. And you're like, well, but they liked it a little bit more, so now I'm going to do these 5 things. And the next thing you know, that's sucking all your resource for something that, like, you kind of knew up front nobody was really that interested in, right? So that's something where you have to get good at recognizing when that's the case and say, I'm going to shelve that for now. Let me move on to these other things here that we think have maybe some more potential to try out.
A lot of strategic decisions.
Yeah. So that's an example. Also just where to, allocate your money. That's of course an important one too, right? There's certain things where, if you're experienced in the space, you can figure out how do you get better deals on things, how can you get free credits from, Amazon or Google or, whatever companies, right? But then at some point, there's certain things you just have to pay for. And you'd say that you're never going to have as much money as you wish you did to pay for all these things. You have to kind of decide where are the things that are the most important. Like, if we don't buy this thing, we don't have a product, versus, well, if we don't buy this thing, we have to build it ourselves and maintain it ourselves. And that's going to take more time, but it's not going to take half of our, existing budget. Right. So, you have a lot of those things you have to think through as well.
I think I've learned a lot today. So thank you, Jake.
Yeah. Thank you. Happy to be here.